A millionaire sees his shy son being surrounded by bullies at school when an orphan girl steps in bravely and shouts, "Leave him alone now. He's my friend." Little did she know the father was secretly watching everything, and what he does next is shocking. The aroma of single-origin Arabica coffee, freshly ground and intense, hung in the air of the penthouse office like the promise of victory. Arthur Montenegro inhaled deeply, feeling the expensive scent mix with his own euphoria, a potent cocktail that made his heart beat faster. From the height of his glass and steel empire, the city sprawled below like a map of his conquests, a testament to decades of hard work and, he admitted to himself, a stubborn streak of luck. But lately, luck seemed to have abandoned him. His company, Montenegro Holdings, once a colossus of stability, now teetered on the brink of a financial abyss. Lost contracts, bad investments, and a blind trust in advisors who had proven incompetent had led him to this hot Tuesday morning, to this one phone call that would define everything. He smoothed the lapel of his Italian suit, a gesture to calm the nerves that insisted on vibrating beneath his skin. The call from Mikhail Petrov, the international investor who had promised a life-saving injection of capital, was the only thing that mattered. It was his redemption. In a discreet corner of the vast office, Elena moved with the silent efficiency of someone who had learned to be invisible. She emptied the wastebaskets and dusted the mahogany surfaces with a grace that belied the weariness in her shoulders. Beside her, sitting on a small leather bench normally reserved for important clients, was her 8-year-old daughter, Sophia. The girl had her dark hair in 2 tight braids and a sketchbook in her lap, but her large brown eyes weren't fixed on the paper. They moved around the room with an attention few children her age possessed, absorbing every detail, from the glint of the sun on the distant skyscrapers to the way her mother's boss tapped his fingers on the desk. An anxious rhythm that betrayed his calm facade. Sophia had come with her mother today because her school was closed for an emergency fumigation and there was no one else to leave her with. To her, this office was an alien world, a place of silence and power that contrasted violently with the sounds and struggles of her neighborhood in the outer boroughs. She had learned early on to read people, to spot the lie in a smile and the danger in an overly friendly gesture. It was a survival instinct. Arthur barely noticed their presence. To him, they were part of the furniture, a necessary service to maintain the appearance of his success. His focus was locked on the sleek designer phone on his desk. He had rehearsed the conversation dozens of times in his mind. He would be grateful, but firm, visionary, but prudent. He would show Petrov that his investment wasn't just a bailout, but a golden opportunity. A soft knock on the door pulled him from his reverie. His executive assistant poked her head in. "Mr. Montenegro, sorry to interrupt, but the audit committee has called an emergency meeting. They need your signature on a few documents. It'll just be a minute." Arthur scowled, irritated by the interruption. "Now? I'm waiting for the most important call of my life." "I know, sir, but they insist it's urgent. 5 minutes, tops." Resigned, he stood up, adjusting the knot of his tie. "Elena, if this phone rings, don't answer it. I'll be right back." He walked out, leaving the door ajar in his haste. The ensuing silence was broken by the shrill, insistent ring of the telephone. The sound seemed to fill every inch of the office, urgent and demanding. Elena froze, her boss's words echoing in her mind. She looked at the device as if it were a dangerous animal. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. It was then that Sophia stood up. With a determination that surprised her own mother, she walked to the imposing desk, climbed onto the plush leather chair, and picked up the heavy receiver. Arthur, returning down the hall sooner than he'd expected, heard the small, childish voice through the crack in the door. He paused, his hand on the doorknob, a wave of confusion washing over him as he heard the cold, firm words of an 8-year-old girl addressed to the man he considered his savior. "Don't you ever call my boss again." Arthur pushed the door open with a contained force, the sound of the wood hitting the frame echoing the chaos in his mind. The scene before him was surreal. The little girl, far too small for the CEO's chair, holding the phone with the solemnity of a judge delivering a sentence, while her mother, Elena, stood frozen near the window, her face ashen. For a moment, time seemed to stop. The only sound was the soft hum of the air conditioning and the furious pounding of Arthur's heart in his ears. The initial confusion gave way to a wave of icy rage. He had been meticulous, every step of the deal with Petrov calculated, and now the absurd intervention of a child threatened to destroy everything. "What do you think you're doing?" His voice came out lower and more dangerous than he intended, his gaze fixed on Elena. "I gave you one instruction, one single, simple instruction." Elena flinched, her hands twisting the cleaning cloth she held. "Mr. Montenegro, I'm so sorry. I don't know what to say. It happened so fast." She took a step forward, as if to shield her daughter with her own body. "It's my fault. I should have been quicker." "It wasn't her fault. It was me," Sophia said, her voice surprisingly steady. She placed the receiver back on the cradle with a decisive click and slid off the chair, facing the towering man without blinking. The absence of fear in her eyes was what unsettled Arthur the most. He crouched down, trying to meet her gaze, a tactic he used in negotiations to intimidate. "Do you have any idea what you've just done? That was the person who was going to save this company, save your mother's job. You may have just cost us millions of dollars with your little game." The word game dripped with contempt, but it didn't faze the girl. "He wasn't going to save anything," she replied, the conviction in her voice unshakable. "He was going to rob you." Arthur let out a short, incredulous laugh. "Rob me? And how would you, an 8-year-old child, know that?" It was ridiculous, absurd. He was discussing international finance with the cleaning lady's daughter. "Because I've heard that voice before," she explained, and for the first time, a shadow of a painful memory crossed her face. "Yesterday, when Mom was cleaning the conference room, you were talking to him on speakerphone. I heard him, and his voice. It's the same as the man who came to our neighborhood last year." She paused, the details surfacing in her mind with terrible clarity. "He promised good jobs for my friend's parents, said he was going to build a factory. People gave him the little money they had, their life savings. He took the money and then he disappeared. My friend Leo's dad lost everything. They had to move." The simplicity of the account hit Arthur harder than any market analysis. He straightened up, skepticism battling an uneasy chill that was beginning to spread through his chest. "That's impossible. Mikhail Petrov is a respected investor. You must be confusing the voices." "I'm not," Sophia insisted. "The way he talks is the same. He uses nice words to make people feel safe, but his eyes yesterday, on the video call, his eyes were the same. Cold, like an animal waiting to pounce." Arthur fell silent, the image of a neighborhood conman overlapping with that of the sophisticated Russian businessman. Could it be true? Had his desperate need to believe in Petrov blinded him to this extent? The confidence that was the bedrock of his success suddenly felt like a house of cards, ready to collapse. He looked at the now silent phone, then at the serious face of the little girl who had just committed an act of either insubordination or salvation. In that moment, he didn't know which it was, and that uncertainty was more terrifying than any financial crisis he had ever faced. For a long moment, Arthur remained motionless, the echo of Sophia's words resonating in the oppressive silence of his office. Logic, common sense, his entire life experience screamed that this was a child's fantasy, an unfortunate coincidence. But there was something in the girl's unwavering seriousness, in the complete absence of malice or make-believe in her eyes, that stopped him from dismissing the accusation outright. He felt like a man standing on a thin sheet of ice, hearing the first subtle crack beneath his feet. With an abrupt gesture, he composed himself, the mask of authority falling back into place. "Eleanor, take your daughter to the break room. Get her some juice, a cookie, and wait there until I call for you." His voice was controlled, but the command was not an invitation. It was a temporary dismissal from his presence, as he couldn't bear to look into those accusing eyes while he tried to fix the damage. Elena, relieved and terrified in equal measure, nodded quickly and guided Sophia out, closing the door with reverent care. Alone, Arthur sank into his chair, the adrenaline of his anger replaced by a cold, sticky anxiety. He had to reverse this. He needed to talk to Petrov, explain the misunderstanding, perhaps invent a story about a bad connection. He picked up his cell phone and dialed the investor's personal number. It rang once, twice, 5 times. Voicemail. The recorded voice, smooth with a polished Russian accent, seemed to mock him. He tried Petrov's office in Zurich, an answering machine in German. He tried the personal assistant, straight to voicemail. The silence on the other end of the line was more deafening than any accusation. A man about to close a multi-million-dollar deal doesn't just disappear. A chill ran down his spine. The image of the cold eyes Sophia had described returned to his mind. He shook his head, trying to push away the paranoia. He needed a rational perspective. He called Ricardo, his CFO, a man of numbers and facts, immune to hysterics. "Ricardo, any word from Petrov?" he asked, trying to keep his voice casual. "Not yet, Arthur. We have everything lined up for the wire transfer as soon as he gives the green light. The bank is just waiting for our final confirmation. We're cutting it close on the deadline." "You know that?" The pressure in Ricardo's voice amplified Arthur's own. "Postpone it. Tell them I'm reviewing a last-minute clause." "Postpone? Arthur, what's going on? You sounded euphoric this morning. Petrov said he would call to confirm everything. Did the call happen?" Arthur hesitated. Admitting that the cleaning lady's daughter had answered and insulted his savior was unthinkable. "We had a technical issue with the call. I have a bad feeling about this, Ricardo. Just stall for an hour." On the other end, a sigh of frustration. "A bad feeling doesn't pay the creditors, Arthur. Be quick." He hung up, sweat beading on his forehead. What was he doing? Risking everything on a child's story. Driven by an impulse he couldn't explain, he opened his laptop and pulled up the email with the final instructions for the wire transfer. The document was there, impeccable. The bank's name, the address in Switzerland, the SWIFT and IBAN codes. It all looked perfectly legitimate. His team had already vetted it, but his team hadn't heard Sophia's story. He opened a new browser tab, his heart hammering against his ribs. He typed the bank's name, Helvetia Trust and Commerce, into a global financial institution verification portal, a site he rarely used, reserved for the deepest due diligence. He copied and pasted the institution's registration number, a technical detail in the document's footer. He felt foolish. What did he expect to find? A typo. He hit enter. The page loaded for a second that felt like an eternity. Then the result appeared. It wasn't a typo. It was a line of text, short, brutal, and highlighted in an alarming red that drove all the air from his lungs. Institution flagged. Registered address corresponds to an abandoned building. Under investigation for international fraud. The red on the screen seemed to pulse. A silent siren screaming the truth he had refused to see. Abandoned building, international fraud, the words drilled into his mind, tearing away the veil of desperate denial he had built around himself. The office, which once seemed a symbol of his power, suddenly became a glass cage, exposing his stupidity to the entire world. He wasn't a shrewd businessman on the verge of a triumphant comeback. He was a fish on a hook, about to be pulled into the dark. The click of the receiver, that little girl's firm voice, it hadn't been an act of sabotage. It had been a last-second rescue. The sweat that had beaded on his forehead now ran cold down his back. He thought of Ricardo's email, the prepped wire transfer. The green light he had been minutes away from giving, if the meeting with the board hadn't pulled him from the room, if Sophia hadn't been there, he would have answered, confirmed the transaction, and sent millions of dollars to a ghost, to a non-existent address in a crumbling building in Switzerland. It would have been the end, not just for Montenegro Holdings, but for his reputation, his life. The humiliation was a bitter taste in his mouth, so strong it almost made him gag. He stood, his legs shaky, and walked to the door. He needed to speak to them, not as a boss, not as the millionaire in his ivory tower, but as the fool who had just been saved by the unlikely wisdom of a child. He opened the break room door and found them sitting at a small table. Elena was holding her daughter's hands, whispering words of comfort, fear still etched on her face. Sophia stared into her cup of orange juice, her sketchbook forgotten beside it. At the sight of him, Elena jumped to her feet, her body tense, ready to receive her sentence. "Mr. Montenegro, I swear she will never again." "Elena, please," he interrupted, his voice hoarse, stripped of all its former authority. He knelt in front of Sophia, the expensive fabric of his pants creasing on the cold floor. The girl looked up, and for the first time he saw not just a child, but an observer, someone who saw the world without the filters of ego and greed that had blinded him. "You were right," he said, the words coming out with difficulty. "The man, Petrov, he's a con artist. You saved everything." Elena's expression shifted from fear to sheer disbelief. Sophia, however, just nodded slowly, as if she had been expecting this confirmation. It was the reaction of someone who knows they've seen the truth and needs no validation, only acknowledgement. "I know," she said simply. "Leo's dad cried a lot. I didn't want you to cry, too." The simplicity of that sentence, the pure, childish empathy, broke through Arthur's last barrier of pride. He didn't cry, but he felt a knot tighten in his throat. He, who lived in a world of sharks, of ruthless negotiations and fragile alliances, had forgotten what genuine loyalty looked like. Just then, his cell phone vibrated in his pocket. A text from an unknown number. He opened it, his heart still racing. There was no text, just an image, a photo taken from a distance, of Elena and Sophia entering the building earlier that morning. Below the image, a single, chilling sentence. "Curious children sometimes get lost on their way home." The chill he'd felt before was nothing compared to the ice that now spread through his veins. The scam had failed, but the threat was just beginning. They knew who Sophia was, and they knew where to find her. The image on the phone was grainy, shot from an angle that suggested surveillance, a predator watching its prey. The accompanying sentence wasn't an explicit threat, but something far worse, a veiled promise, cold and calculated. Arthur's world of cutthroat business, with its boardroom battles and financial takedowns, had never ventured into this dark territory. This was a different language, the language of the streets that Sophia knew so well, where violence didn't have to be shouted to be understood. He looked up from the screen, his face a mask of concern that had completely replaced the humiliation of moments before. He looked at Elena and Sophia, no longer as an employee and her daughter, but as two people he had inadvertently put in mortal danger. His vulnerability, his greed, had opened a door for this evil to enter their lives. The guilt weighed on him like an anchor. "Elena," he said, his voice low and urgent, "you can't go home today. Not tomorrow either. You'll stay with me." Elena, who hadn't seen the message, looked at him, confused. "Sir, I don't understand. I appreciate your kindness, but we have our home, our things." "It's not kindness, it's a necessity," he cut in, trying to remain calm so as not to frighten them. "Those people, the man on the phone, they might be angry. It's better to be safe." He didn't want to show her the photo, didn't want to plant that seed of fear in the heart of the girl who had already shown so much courage. But Elena, with a mother's intuition, sensed the shift in the atmosphere. The danger was palpable. A static electricity in the air. What happened? What did they do? Her question hung in the air as Arthur's phone rang. It was Ricardo, he answered, turning away to give himself a sliver of privacy, though every instinct told him not to take his eyes off the mother and child. "Arthur, what the hell is going on?" Ricardo's voice was a mix of panic and irritation. "I just got a call from a supposed agent from the SEC. An anonymous tip was filed against Montenegro Holdings. Money laundering, tax fraud. The list is a mile long. They're threatening to freeze our accounts by morning. This came out of nowhere. Does this have anything to do with your bad feeling?" Arthur felt the floor drop out from under him. It was a two-pronged attack. First, the financial scam. Now, the destruction of his reputation. Petrov, or whoever he was, wasn't just a thief. He was a cruel strategist. Thwarted in his first plan, he was now using the system itself against his victim, planting false evidence, creating a smokescreen to cover his own tracks while simultaneously annihilating his target. The anonymous tip was the perfect weapon. It created chaos, diverted attention, and put him on the defensive, forcing him to prove his innocence, while the real culprit vanished into the shadows. "Ricardo, listen carefully," Arthur said, his mind racing. "Cancel everything related to Petrov. Erase all communication records. Don't talk to anyone about this. I'll handle it." "Handle it? Arthur, we're talking about a federal investigation. This could destroy us." "I know. Just trust me." He hung up before Ricardo could protest further. The trap was closing. They weren't just after his money. They were after his freedom. And now, because of the photo, he knew that Elena and Sophia's safety was intrinsically linked to his own survival. Protecting himself meant protecting them. He turned back to them, the decision solidifying on his face. "Pack your things. You're coming to my house. Now." He looked at Sophia, who was watching him with an understanding that was far beyond her years. "They're scared of us," she said, not as a question, but as a statement. "They know that I know who they are." The girl's simple, true statement hit Arthur squarely. The enemy's greatest weakness wasn't the coming investigation, nor the police. It was this small witness, with her infallible memory and unexpected courage. And that suddenly made her the most important and the most endangered person in the world. The drive to Arthur's mansion in the wooded suburbs was tense and silent. He drove his luxury sedan with a fierce concentration, his eyes constantly checking the rearview mirrors, scanning for any car that seemed to be following them. Every vehicle that stayed behind them for more than a block became a source of anxiety. Eleanor sat in the passenger seat, rigid, her hands clutching her purse in her lap like a life raft. In the back, Sophia looked out the window, not with the curiosity of a child seeing a new, wealthy neighborhood, but with the vigilance of a sentinel. Her world had changed dramatically in just a few hours. The office that was just her mother's workplace had become a battlefield, and now she was being whisked away to a refuge that felt like another planet. The mansion was more fortress than home. High walls, a wrought iron gate, and a state-of-the-art security system that Arthur had always considered an extravagance, but for which he was now immensely grateful. As they entered, the contrast with Elena and Sophia's cramped apartment could not have been starker. The foyer was vast, with a polished marble floor that reflected the light from a crystal chandelier. The silence was profound, broken only by the sound of their footsteps. Arthur led them to a guest wing that was rarely used. "You'll stay here. It's safe. No one knows this address besides my most trusted staff." He showed them the bedrooms, the small sitting area, and the ensuite bathroom, all decorated with impersonal luxury. "I'll have someone buy clothes and whatever else you need," Elena nodded, overwhelmed. She looked around at the expensive furniture and the art on the walls. She felt like a misplaced piece, an intruder in a world that wasn't hers, dragged into a crisis she didn't create. Her primary concern, however, was her daughter. She knelt in front of Sophia, who was standing in the middle of the room, looking even smaller amidst the grandeur. "Are you okay, mi amor?" Sophia nodded, but her eyes were fixed on the large window overlooking the impeccably manicured gardens. "The man from the picture, will he find us here?" The direct question, devoid of any childishness, hung in the air. Arthur, who had overheard from the doorway, felt a pang of admiration for the girl's resilience. "No, I won't let him," he answered, with more conviction than he felt. While they settled in, Arthur went to his home office. A sanctuary of dark wood and leather. He needed information. He hired a top-tier private security firm over the phone, paying an exorbitant price for secrecy and efficiency. Their mission: find out everything about Mikhail Petrov, investigate the source of the anonymous tip, and most importantly, ensure the physical protection of Elena and Sophia. He spent hours on the phone, talking to lawyers, crisis consultants, moving pieces on a board that was changing by the minute. With every call, the picture grew darker. His lawyer confirmed the investigation was real and aggressive. His contacts in the financial world whispered about the ghost investors, a group known for setting up elaborate schemes to take over vulnerable companies, using a combination of financial seduction and legal blackmail. Petrov wasn't just a name. It was a front used by many. He wasn't fighting a man. He was fighting an organization. Later that night, exhausted, he went to check on his new guests. He found the bedroom door ajar. Elena was asleep in an armchair, exhaustion having finally claimed her. Sophia was sitting up in bed, not sleeping, but with her sketchbook on her lap. She wasn't drawing flowers or houses like most children. She was drawing faces, with a startling accuracy for her age. She was recreating from memory the face of Petrov as she'd seen him on the video call. And next to him, two other faces that Arthur didn't recognize. "Who are they?" he asked softly, stepping into the room. Sophia pointed to a man with a wide face and a square jaw. "This one was with him yesterday, at the coffee shop across the street from your building. They talked for a minute. The man seemed to be giving orders." She then pointed to the second face, a thinner man with small, close-set eyes. "And this one, I've seen him near our apartment a few times this week. He was always looking at our building." The revelation hit him like a physical blow. They weren't just watching the office. They were watching their home. The threat wasn't a reaction to today's phone call. The planning had been in motion for a long time, meticulous. And Sophia, with her quiet attention, had noticed the pieces of the puzzle that no one else saw. But before Arthur could process this new information, his cell phone vibrated. A text from his head of security. "We have a problem. HR at your company just terminated Elena's employment. The reason given is breach of security protocol. The order came from the top, but it wasn't from you." The message glowed on the screen, every word a calculated blow. Breach of security protocol. It was a corporate excuse as thin as tissue paper, but brutally effective. Arthur felt a wave of impotent fury. This wasn't a bureaucratic mistake. It was a deliberate move, a stab in the back from within his own company. Someone on his board, someone he trusted, was working with Petrov. Elena's termination wasn't just a cruel retaliation. It was a strategic maneuver. By firing her, they legally removed her from his circle of protection. She was no longer his employee, and her and Sophia's presence in his house could easily be twisted. Used against him in the looming investigation. They could accuse him of coercing a former employee, of tampering with a witness. The play was diabolical in its simplicity, and, most cruelly, it removed the physical barrier keeping them safe. Without the job, their reason for being under his roof became tenuous, and the pressure for them to return to their neighborhood, within reach of the men watching them, would grow with each passing day. He looked at Eleanor, still sleeping in the armchair, her face etched with exhaustion and worry. To tell her she'd lost her job now, in the middle of this storm, seemed a cruelty beyond measure. That job was her lifeline, her only source of income in an already precarious world. Taking it away was like cutting that rope. For a moment, he considered ignoring it, reversing the decision in the morning and finding the traitor on his team. But he knew it was too late. The damage was done. The termination would be on record. The news would spread. It was a piece his enemies had placed on the board, and he would have to play around it. His gaze shifted to Sophia, who was still watching him, her pencil poised over the paper. She seemed to sense the change in the atmosphere, the new layer of danger that had just settled over them. She didn't know the details, but she understood betrayal. She saw it every day in her world. Her expression wasn't one of fear, but of a somber resignation. "What is it?" she asked in a whisper, so as not to wake her mother. Arthur hesitated, searching for the right words. There was no way to sugarcoat it. "Someone at my work did something very bad. They made your mom lose her job." He expected tears, anger, a child's reaction. Instead, Sophia just looked down at her drawings. "They want us to leave, don't they? So we'll be alone." The girl's sharp perception was like a blade. She saw through the layers of corporate intrigue to the heart of the matter: isolation. They wanted to separate them, to break the unlikely alliance that had formed between the millionaire and the child from the outer boroughs. It was a divide-and-conquer tactic. In that instant, something inside Arthur shifted. The crisis was no longer just about saving his company or his reputation. It had become personal. Firing Elena wasn't an attack on an employee. It was an attack on him, using the most vulnerable person to get to him. It was a cowardly act, and it awakened a protective fury in him that he hadn't felt in years. He was no longer just on the defensive, reacting to the enemy's moves. Now, he was going to hunt them. He picked up his phone and sent a single text to his private investigator. "Forget Petrov for now. I want the communication logs for every member of my board of directors for the last 48 hours. I want to know who gave the order to fire Elena Morales. No exceptions and no rules." It was a turning point. The battle was no longer external, against a faceless enemy. The war had turned inward. The traitor was in his house, in his castle, and before he could fight the monsters outside, he had to expose the ghost within his own walls. He felt like a king whose castle was under siege, only to discover that the guard who opened the gate for the enemy was one of his most trusted generals. What he didn't know was that the investigation into his board would reveal something far more shocking than simple financial betrayal. It would lead to a personal, painful connection to his own past, a secret he thought was buried forever, and which now threatened to destroy what little stability he had left. The days that followed turned Arthur's mansion into a quiet, tense command center. On one side, a team of lawyers worked tirelessly to combat the fabricated allegations, gathering documents and preparing his defense. On the other, the private security team delved deep into the digital world of his board of directors, a discreet hunt for a trail of betrayal. Arthur moved between these two worlds like a ghost in his own home, fueled by coffee and the adrenaline of the crisis. The weight of the situation was crushing, but the presence of Elena and Sophia, however complicated, gave him an unexpected focus. He was no longer fighting just for himself. He was fighting for them. During the day, Elena tried to maintain a routine for Sophia. They explored the garden, read books from Arthur's vast library, and helped the cook prepare meals, an attempt at normality amidst the chaos. Elena, though terrified by the loss of her job and the uncertainty of the future, showed remarkable strength. She refused to be just a victim to be protected. She began organizing Arthur's files, screening his calls, and managing his schedule with an efficiency his previous assistant had never possessed. She found a purpose in this gilded cage, a way to contribute, to not be a burden. Arthur observed this dynamic with a mix of gratitude and melancholy. He had spent years building an empire, surrounded by people who fawned over his money and power, yet he had never felt less alone than he did now, with these two strangers in his home. A silent connection was growing between them, forged in adversity. They were three castaways in a luxury lifeboat, adrift on a sea of peril. Sophia, in turn, continued to be his secret weapon. One afternoon, while Arthur was on a stressful conference call with his lawyers, she came into his office and handed him a new page from her sketchbook. On it was a detailed drawing of a small wooden bird. "Where did you see this?" he asked, intrigued. "The bad man, Petrov. He had a ring," she said. "It had this little bird on it. I just remembered it now." Arthur felt a chill. He magnified the video call footage his security team had recovered. The quality was poor, but there it was, a metallic glint on Petrov's hand. With the help of an image analysis expert, they managed to get a glimpse of the ring. It was a falcon, the symbol of an obscure Eastern European criminal organization known for infiltrating companies for money laundering. They weren't amateurs. They were professionals. Sophia's memory had given them a crucial lead. That night, Arthur's private investigator called. His voice was grave. "We found the traitor. The order to fire Miss Morales came from Victor's computer. Victor Andrade, your COO." The name hit Arthur like a gut punch. Victor, his friend, his right-hand man for over 15 years. The man with whom he had built the company from the ground up, who knew his secrets, his weaknesses. The betrayal was so profound, so unthinkable, that for a moment Arthur couldn't breathe. "It can't be," he whispered. "There must be a mistake." "There's no mistake," the investigator continued. "We tracked the communications. Victor has been in contact with intermediaries linked to the Falcon network for months. He provided all the information about your company's financial vulnerability. He served you up on a silver platter, Arthur." The investigator paused, as if to brace Arthur for the final blow. "And there's more. We found out why. Victor is drowning in gambling debt. Millions. He didn't betray you for greed. He betrayed you out of desperation. And the people he owes, well, it seems they're the same group Petrov represents." The revelation was devastating. Victor wasn't a monster, but a broken, cornered man. And now, Arthur would have to confront him, not just as a traitor, but as a lost friend. The battle he thought was against an external enemy had revealed itself to be an intimate tragedy, a conflict of loyalty and deception that would tear him apart. The discovery of Victor's betrayal left a taste of ash in Arthur's mouth. It was a pain unlike any financial setback. It was a wound to the soul. 15 years of camaraderie, of shared victories and defeats, now felt like one long, elaborate lie. He spent the night awake, replaying memories, searching for signs, for any hint that the friend he knew was coming apart under the weight of his secrets. He found nothing. Victor had always been the personification of loyalty, the pillar he leaned on. The confrontation was inevitable, but Arthur dreaded it. How could he look into the eyes of a man who was like a brother and see the reflection of his own ruin? The next day, he summoned Victor to his home for a meeting, under the pretext of discussing a defense strategy. The presence of discreetly positioned security guards was the only sign that this was no normal business meeting. Victor arrived looking weary, his shoulders slumped, the look of concern on his face so convincing that for a moment, Arthur almost doubted the evidence. They sat in his office, the same room where they had celebrated so many successes. The air was heavy with unspoken words. "How are you holding up through all this?" Victor asked, his voice full of a false solidarity that now sounded grotesque. "It's a nightmare, but we'll get through it, together, like always." The word "together" was the last straw. Arthur pushed a folder across the mahogany desk. Inside were printouts of Victor's communications, the records of his debts, the irrefutable proof of his betrayal. "Explain this, Victor." Victor's face drained of all color. He opened the folder, his eyes scanning the pages. the facade of the concerned friend crumbling to reveal the desperate man beneath. The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating. Finally, he looked up, and there were no more lies in his eyes, just an infinite exhaustion and a crushing shame. "I had no choice, Arthur," he whispered, his voice cracking. "They had everything. Pictures, videos. They threatened my family, my wife, my daughters. They said, if I didn't cooperate." He didn't need to finish the sentence. The picture was clear. The criminal network didn't just exploit financial weakness. It embedded itself into the lives of its victims, using love and fear as weapons. Victor began to cry, dry, painful sobs from a man who had lost everything, most of all himself. "I never wanted this. I tried to fight back, but they're relentless. Every time I paid one debt, another would appear. It was a bottomless pit. When they told me about the plan for Montenegro Holdings, I saw it as a way out. I thought, if I helped them, they would leave me alone." Arthur listened, the fury he felt slowly being eroded by a wave of tragic compassion. Victor wasn't the architect of the plan. He was just another pawn. A victim turned executioner. The true face of the enemy was even crueler than he had imagined. They didn't just steal money. They broke spirits, turned friends into enemies, and destroyed lives from the inside out. The conversation was interrupted by a soft knock on the door. It was Elena. She was holding a tablet. "Mr. Montenegro, I'm sorry to interrupt, but you need to see this. It's from the local news in our neighborhood." On the screen was a short, disturbing report. A boy of about 10, Leo, Sophia's friend, was being interviewed. He was saying, his voice trembling, that strange men had been showing up in the neighborhood, asking questions about Sophia, offering money for information about where she and her mother were. "They said she was a very curious girl," Leo told the camera, "and that curiosity could be dangerous." The threat was no longer veiled or sent by text. It was now public. They were using the community against them, turning neighbors into potential informants. They were openly hunting for Sophia, and the whole world was watching. The TV report was a gut punch. The threat, once confined to cell phones and whispers, now echoed in the public square, broadcast into thousands of homes. The criminals' strategy was clear and terrifying. They were escalating the pressure, making Elena and Sophia's anonymity impossible. By broadcasting their interest in the girl to the entire community, they not only marked her as a target, but also isolated her family, sowing fear and distrust among their neighbors. Who would dare help the mother and child now that they were associated with such dangerous people? Arthur felt his blood run cold. He had moved them from their home to protect them, but in doing so, he had uprooted them from their support network, however fragile. Now they were refugees in his golden castle, while the danger circulated freely in their territory, their home. Victor, who had watched the report over Arthur's shoulder, seemed to shrink even further into his chair. The weight of his complicity was written on his pale face. "This is how they do it," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "They surround you. They cut off all your escape routes until the only option is to do what they say. They're doing it to them now." In that moment, Arthur knew the defensive approach was over. It was no longer enough to protect himself and wait for the storm to pass. He had to attack. He had to take the fight to them before they got anywhere near Sophia again. He turned to Victor, compassion giving way to a steely resolve. "You're going to help me, Victor. You owe me that. You're going to tell me everything. Names, places, methods. Every single detail you know about this organization." Victor hesitated, fear stark in his eyes. "They'll kill me. They'll go after my family. They're already going after someone else's family because of you," Arthur retorted, his voice sharp. "I will protect your wife and daughters. I'll get them out of the country tonight if I have to. But you have a choice to make. You can either go down with them, or you can help me bring them down." Victor's internal struggle was visible. It was fear against the last spark of his honor. Finally, with a sigh that sounded like a surrender, He nodded. The information began to flow, a river of filth and corruption. Victor described the network's structure, the fronts they used, the methods of coercion. He revealed that the next step in their plan was no longer financial. With the scam thwarted and Arthur's reputation under legal assault, the objective had shifted. They wanted the proof Sophia might have, the drawings, the memories. They wanted to discredit her, perhaps even force her to change her testimony, painting her as a fantasy-prone child, manipulated by Arthur. While Victor's confession unfolded in the office, Elena found Sophia in the garden. The girl was sitting under a large oak tree, hugging her knees. Her sketchbook closed beside her. She wasn't crying, but her small body was tense. The childish joy that sometimes surfaced in her eyes now completely extinguished. "I saw Leo on TV," she said in a low voice, not looking at her mother. "They're looking for me." Elena sat beside her on the soft grass, her heart aching. She wanted to say that everything would be okay, that she was safe, but the words felt empty and false. Instead, she told her the truth. "Yes, they are. Because they're afraid of you." Sophia finally looked at her, her large eyes filled with a painful confusion. "But I'm just a kid. Why would they be afraid of me?" "Because you're brave, my love," Elena said, her voice thick with both pride and dread. "You saw the truth when no one else did, and the truth is, the one thing people like them can't control. It's the light that sends the cockroaches scattering." She held her daughter tightly, feeling the fragility of her bones, the rapid beat of her heart. In that moment, under the shade of that ancient tree, Elena made a decision. She would no longer be a passive spectator in her daughter's protection. If the world wouldn't protect her, she would become a shield herself. She stood up, determination hardening her features, and marched back toward the house, toward Arthur's office. She had an idea, a risky plan born of desperation and a mother's love. A plan that could either expose them all or put her daughter in even greater danger. Elena paused at the office door, hesitation battling the urgency that drove her. Inside, Arthur and Victor were hunched over a table, surrounded by documents and hastily drawn mind maps. The atmosphere was that of a war room. Seeing her, Arthur looked up, the surprise on his face quickly replaced by concern at her determined expression. "Elena, is everything okay?" "Sophia, she's scared." "But she's strong," Elena replied, stepping into the room. Her eyes flickered over Victor with a coldness that made him flinch, but her focus was on Arthur. "I heard the news. I know what they're doing. They're trying to isolate us, to hunt us. But I'm not going to hide and wait anymore." Arthur stood, moving toward her. "I understand your frustration, but we're putting a plan together. Victor is giving us everything we need. The authorities will be notified." "The authorities?" she interrupted, her voice laced with a skepticism born from a lifetime of broken promises and failed systems. "Will they believe the word of a cleaning woman and her 8-year-old daughter against rich, powerful men with expensive lawyers? Will they act fast enough before they find us? We know how slow justice can be, Mr. Montenegro. In my world, waiting for official help is often waiting in vain." Her words were a dose of reality. Arthur, used to moving the gears of power with a phone call, was forced to see the situation through her eyes. To Elena, the law was a distant and often ineffective entity. Real protection came from community, from street smarts, from direct action. "What are you suggesting?" he asked, the respect in his voice genuine. "They want the proof Sophia has, right? They think they can discredit her," Elena said, the plan crystallizing in her mind. "So let's give them what they want, but not how they expect." She took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "We're going to leak Sophia's drawings to the press, not the mainstream media, who might twist the story, but to an independent investigative blogger, someone known for defending the little guy against the powerful, someone who can't be bought or intimidated. Arthur and Victor stared at her, stunned. The idea was audacious and incredibly risky. You want to expose her identity? Put her even more in the spotlight, Arthur questioned, his protective instincts screaming. She's already in the spotlight, Elena countered. The difference is, right now, they control the narrative. They paint her as a curious girl in danger. We're going to change that. We'll show her as a brave witness. The drawings aren't just a child's scribbles. They're evidence. Petrov's face, his accomplices, the ring with the falcon. When the public sees that, the story will change. It will no longer be about a millionaire in trouble, but about a smart little girl who unmasked a criminal network. Public opinion is a powerful shield. They'll have a harder time moving against a child who has become a symbol. Victor, who had been silent, cleared his throat. She's right, Arthur. These people's biggest weakness is exposure. They operate in the shadows. Sunlight terrifies them. If her story goes viral, they'll be forced to back off, at least temporarily. The plan was a double-edged sword. It could grant them the protection of visibility, or it could paint an even bigger target on their backs. It was a gamble, an all-or-nothing bet. Arthur looked at Elena, at the unshakable, maternal strength in her eyes, and knew he had no choice. He had spent his entire life managing risk, calculating odds. But here, in this room, the best strategy didn't come from a business playbook, but from the heart of a mother willing to risk everything to save her child. "All right," he said. "The decision made. We'll do it your way. We're going to turn their greatest fear into our most powerful weapon." He picked up his phone, not to call the police, but to call a contact in the alternative media who owed him a very big favor. The hunt was about to be reversed. The night fell like a heavy blanket over the mansion, but no one slept. The air crackled with a nervous energy, the calm before the storm. Elena's plan had been set in motion with dizzying speed. Digital copies of Sophia's drawings, accompanied by an anonymous but detailed account provided by Victor through a secure channel, were sent to the investigative blogger. Now all they could do was wait and watch for the shockwaves. Arthur, Elena, and a visibly shaken Victor gathered in front of a large screen in the home theater, refreshing the blog's webpage every minute. Sophia was asleep, or at least pretending to be, in her room, oblivious to the digital war being waged in her name. Around 3 in the morning, it happened. The post went live. The headline was explosive. The girl who drew danger, how an 8-year-old unmasked an international fraud ring. The article was masterful. It didn't just show the drawings, it contextualized them, explaining the accuracy of the details, the significance of the falcon ring, the identities of the accomplices. The narrative was powerful, the unlikely hero, street smarts versus corporate arrogance, the courage of a child against the cruelty of calculating predators. The reaction was instant and overwhelming. Within minutes, the story began to trend on social media. Within an hour, it was a top story. People weren't just sharing, they were engaging, expressing outrage, admiration for Sophia, and fury at her persecutors. The hashtag #ProtectSophia began to spread like wildfire. The public didn't just embrace the story, they adopted it. As Elena had predicted, the narrative had shifted. Sophia was no longer an anonymous victim. She was a symbol. Arthur watched the numbers climb, thousands, then tens of thousands of shares, with a sense of awe. He, who had always trusted in the power of money and influence, was witnessing a force far greater, the power of a true, compelling story. But the victory came at an immediate cost. The enemy, cornered and exposed, reacted with the fury of a wounded animal. Arthur's phone rang. It was his head of security. "Arthur, they're on the move. Our sources say the network is in a panic. They're not backing down. They're doing the opposite. They're coming for you." A second alert came from his lawyers. An emergency motion had been filed in a night court. The charge, Arthur Montenegro, under investigation for fraud. had kidnapped a former employee and her minor child and was coercing them into fabricating evidence to frame his former business partners. They were using the law itself as a battering ram to break down his door. The motion called for the immediate protective custody of Sophia by the state. They don't want to silence her with violence, the lawyer said over the phone, his voice tense. They want to do something worse. They want to take her from you and her mother, put her in a system where they can control her, isolate her, and destroy her credibility forever. And they have a judge who might sign that order any minute. The climax of the crisis was upon them. The final trap wasn't a bullet or a knife, but a pen, a signature on a piece of paper that could separate mother and child and deliver Sophia directly into the hands of her enemies, all under the guise of the law. Time was running out. The authorities, swayed by the initial tip against Arthur and now by this new accusation, were on their way. He looked at Eleanor, terror dawning on her face as she understood they could tear her daughter from her arms. He had to make a decision, the most important of his life: surrender to the law and risk losing Sophia forever, or flee and become an outlaw in the eyes of the world, all to protect the child who had risked everything to save him. A distant siren, barely perceptible at first, began to swell, drawing closer, a wail that announced the end of the game. The sound of the approaching sirens was the soundtrack to their panic. Elena ran towards Sophia's room, maternal instinct screaming to protect her child at all costs. Victor seemed paralyzed by fear, the weight of his past actions crushing him in this decisive moment. But Arthur, amidst the impending chaos, felt a surprising clarity. Running was what they wanted. It would make him look guilty, confirm the narrative they had built. Surrendering without a fight meant handing Sophia over to the system, to an uncertain and dangerous fate. There was a third option, a final gamble, based not on power or money, but on truth. "Nobody is going anywhere," he said, his voice firm and resonant, cutting through the hysteria. "Victor, call your contact in the network. Tell them I surrender, but I have one condition. I want to talk to the man in charge, the real one, not the Petrov puppet. Tell him I have a proposal he can't refuse." Victor looked at him as if he were insane. "They don't negotiate, Arthur. They'll negotiate if the prize is big enough. Make the call." As a trembling Victor dialed the number, Arthur turned to Elena. "Trust me, the truth you talked about, the light. We're going to turn it on so bright there will be no shadows left for them to hide in." When the police cars and social services vehicles pulled up to the imposing gates, Arthur was already there, waiting for them. He wasn't alone. At his side were his lawyers, Victor, and to everyone's surprise, the investigative blogger with a camera streaming live to the hundreds of thousands of people following the drama in real time. The arrival of the authorities turned into a media event. The officer in charge, a seasoned and cautious man, found himself in an impossible position, executing a court order under the watchful eye of the public. Arthur calmly explained the situation. "I am not holding anyone hostage. Ms. Morales and her daughter are my guests and are under my protection. What you are about to do is carry out the will of a criminal organization that is using the justice system as a weapon." It was then that Victor stepped forward. In front of the cameras, in front of the police, he began his confession. He told them everything: the debt, the coercion, the betrayal, the structure of the network. He gave himself up, becoming the key witness the police needed, corroborating every detail of Sophia's story. The live confession was a bombshell. The criminal's carefully constructed narrative collapsed in minutes. Meanwhile, Victor's call had worked. The true leader of the operation, a seemingly legitimate businessman watching the chaos unfold from his own luxury office, agreed to speak with Arthur, certain he could intimidate him into silencing Victor. The call was put on speakerphone for the officers to hear. "You've made a great mistake, Montenegro," the cold voice on the other end said. "You don't know who you're dealing with." "On the contrary," Arthur replied, his voice calm and lethal. "I know exactly who I'm dealing with. And you made the mistake of underestimating not me, but an 8-year-old girl. And now, you have two options. The first is that Victor, under police protection, testifies against your entire operation, providing evidence that will put you in prison for the rest of your life. The second is that you confess to the fraud scheme against Montenegro Holdings, and only that. You present yourself as a lone wolf. Take the fall for the financial scam, and in return, Victor and I forget your criminal network exists. You sacrifice a pawn to save the king. The silence on the other end of the line was heavy. The man was cornered. Victor's live, broadcasted confession had exposed him. To fight would mean the destruction of his entire empire. Arthur's offer was a way out, bitter and humiliating, but a way out nonetheless. The police officer, listening to everything, signaled for his men to lower their weapons. The situation had completely changed. The court order to take Sophia was now irrelevant in the face of an unfolding confession to a much larger crime. The standoff was broken. The truth, broadcast live to the world, had won. Elena, watching from the window with Sophia in her arms, finally let tears of relief stream down her face. The battle hadn't been won with force, but with courage, and a brilliant strategy that used the enemy's own weapon, the manipulation of information, against them. 5 weeks after that hot Tuesday morning, Arthur Montenegro's penthouse office was a transformed space. The aroma of premium coffee was still there, but the tension had been replaced by an atmosphere of renewed purpose. The windows, which once seemed to expose his vulnerability, now offered a view of endless possibility. Montenegro Holdings, saved from the brink of the abyss, was undergoing a deep restructuring. Humbled by the experience, Arthur had shed his sycophantic advisors and promoted people of merit and integrity. The company hadn't just survived, it had emerged stronger, with a new mission. The criminal network, decapitated of its leader, who had taken Arthur's deal and turned himself in for fraud, had crumbled. Subsequent investigations, spurred by Victor's protected testimony, dismantled the rest of the operation. Victor, having cooperated fully, received a reduced sentence, a chance to rebuild his life from the rubble of his poor choices. For Arthur, the biggest change wasn't in business, but in his heart. The mansion, once an empty shell of solitary success, was now a home. He had begun the legal process of adopting Sophia, with the emotional blessing of Eleanor, who had become more than an employee or a protégé. She was his partner, his confidant, the co-founder of his new life. Elena was no longer the invisible cleaning woman. Her intelligence, strength, and integrity had led her to a prominent position in the company. She oversaw the newly created Montenegro Foundation, an organization dedicated to providing legal and financial support to victims of corporate fraud and educating small businesses on how to protect themselves from predators. Her life experience, once a disadvantage, was now her greatest asset. The final scene unfolds in that same office. The afternoon sun casts a golden light across the room. Arthur and Sophia are sitting side by side at the large mahogany desk, not as a boss and his cleaning lady's daughter, but as a father and daughter. They are reviewing materials for a new foundation seminar, Street Smarts in the Corporate World. Sophia, with the seriousness of an expert, points to a slide. "Here, Dad, you need to use simpler words. People need to understand the danger, not be impressed by your vocabulary." Arthur smiles, a genuine, love-filled smile. "You're right, my little strategist, as always." The phone on his desk, the same one that nearly sealed his fate, rings, but now he feels no anxiety. Elena answers it, her voice calm and professional. It's a thank you call from a small business owner the foundation helped save from a similar scam. Arthur watches the scene, his heart overflowing with a wealth that no bank statement could ever measure. He had learned the hard way that true value isn't in what you accumulate, but in what you protect. his greatest vulnerability, his ego, his blind trust, had been exposed and healed by the unlikely wisdom of a child who saw the world with clear eyes and a brave heart. He looked over at Sophia, who was now sketching in her notebook, not the faces of danger, but a picture of her new family, herself, Arthur and Elena, holding hands, smiling under a bright sun. The call that could have destroyed his life hadn't just been intercepted, it had been transformed. The event that nearly brought him to ruin had become the source of his salvation, not just financially, but spiritually. He had found a family in the most unexpected of places and discovered that the world's greatest protection comes not from high walls or security systems, but from the loyalty, courage, and love of those willing to speak the truth, no matter how dangerous it may be. The office was no longer a symbol of power, but of hope, a testament that the deepest darkness can be overcome by the light of a single courageous act, no matter how small its bearer.